Assalamu alaikum. How are you all? I hope you are having a wonderful time. Today I am going to explain the concept of manner of articulation. Now, if you just slightly reflect back on the previous class, at that time I tried to explain the idea of place of articulation and the fundamental distinction between manner and place of articulation is that in place of articulation we primarily concentrate on those areas within the oral cavities that are responsible for the utterances of phonemes, and on the contrary, in manner of articulation we are going to focus on those aspects where we understand that how a particular phoneme is produced. Now, we must admit to this fact that the way we describe and explain the place of articulation, we are also going to explain manner of articulation with regard to certain classifications. So let's begin our discussion. Now, the very first classification that we have in manner of articulation is stops. We also put them in the category of plosives. Now, why we call them plosives? Because whenever you pronounce these phonemes, you would first block the airstream within the mouth and then suddenly release it. How? For that matter, I would like you all to place your hand in front of your mouth and say pa, or say ba, then say ta, then da, then ka and ga. In pronouncing all these consonants, you would feel that the airstream is blocked primarily for a brief period of time and then suddenly released. So this sudden release creates a kind of a plosive effect, and that's the reason why we put these phonemes in the category of stops or plosives. So what are those phonemes? Pa, ba, ta, da, ka, ga. These are known as plosives consonants. Why? Because we pronounce them in a proper certain manner, and that's the reason they are put into the classification of stops. Now let's move toward the second category. The second category that we have is fricatives. Now, what do we mean by fricative sound? Whenever you pronounce fricative consonants, while pronouncing, you create a kind of a friction within the oral cavity. Now, how that friction is produced? For that matter, you need to articulate and utter these phonemes. First, let me write them. First and foremost, you have to understand the actual pronunciation of these phonemes. The very first one is f. The second one, v. The third one, ta. The fourth one, da, sa, za, sh, and then ja. Now these phonemes, if you look at them, whenever you pronounce them, you will feel a kind of a friction inside your oral cavity. How? Place your hand over here, say f. Whenever you say f, you would feel that the air stream is not blocked, but there is a narrow passage and the air has to pass through that narrow passage. So whenever the air is passing through that narrow passage, it creates a kind of a difficulty for it to get past. And for that reason, in order to get past from that narrow passage, what happens that inside the mouth it creates a kind of a friction like f, v, th, v, s, z, sh, zh. So there is no blockade of air but a release through a narrow opening, and that release through a narrow opening creates a kind of a friction. That's why they are known as fricative sound. Let's move towards the third category. Now, most of the students, they mistakenly amalgamate, mix the two classifications of fricatives and affricates. But there is one exception. Although there is a great deal of similarity between affricates and fricatives, but at the same time, I have to confess that affricates are quite different from fricatives. How? Over here, you also feel a kind of a friction, but there is a difference between affricates and fricatives. What is that difference? In affricates, number one, there is a blockade of air stream. It means that the air stream is completely blocked. That's the first distinction that you have in affricate sound. In fricatives, there is no blockade, rather a release through a narrow passage, as opposed to affricate, where there would be a complete blockade for a moment, momentarily. Number two, release through a narrow passage. It means that again there would be a kind of friction while producing, uttering slash articulating those consonants. Now, what are those consonants? Number one, ch. Number two, jaw. Ch, j. Church, judge. Initial sound and the final sound. Initial sound and the final sound. Chirp and jaw. Now, when you pronounce them, just feel ch, ja, ch, ja. While pronouncing them, you feel that the airstream is blocked for a moment completely and then released, but through a narrow opening, and that's the reason why a friction is produced. That is one of the basic misconception on the part of the student, where they mix the concept of affricates with fricatives. But now I hope that this particular conception would have been demolished. Let's move towards the third category. Nasals. Now, if you look at the classification or the term nasals, it is quite indicative of the fact that these phonemes are produced with the help of your nasal cavity. Your nostrils are involved. The airstream has to pass through your nostrils in order to produce these consonant sound. Now, what are those consonants? M, N, and angma. We use these three consonant sounds quite frequently. This one, angma, we use in words like so and so forth. Now, all of them are angma sound. Now, you must remember one thing regarding angma. We mistakenly or on the basis of certain errors mispronounce it or misinterpret it. How? This angma does not attach g to itself. We pronounce these words like ringing. There is g, ringing. But in reality, there is no g. It is like this, ringing, not ringing. There is no g. This one is wrong. This one is accurate. So you must remember one thing, that with angma we do not attach a g effect. That's something you must realize. So whenever you pronounce, you can easily understand that we pronounce it like m, n, angma with the help of nasal cavity. There is no involvement of the oral cavity. That's another classification. Let's move towards the next. Liquids. Now this is yet another classification. In liquids we have L and R. L and R. Now if you look at this L sound, whenever you pronounce L sound inside the mouth, your tongue is taking a particular position. Say L. Where the tongue tip, it goes upward and then slightly curls back, and the air is passing through the sides of the tongue. From where? From the sides of the tongue, like L, L. So when you pronounce L, the air is passing from the sides of the tongue. That's the first phoneme, L. The second one is R. What? R. What happens in R? That the tip of the tongue slightly curls back and touches the middle part of the alveolar ridge. What happens? That's something that you must understand about these sounds. That's why we call them liquids. L and R. L and R. Next classification. Glides. Now, what are glide sound? Whenever you pronounce them like w and ya, w and ya, the tongue inside the oral cavity assumes a kind of positions. That's the reason why we call them gliding. Gliding means the tongue is gliding and taking different position. Just pronounce these words. W and ya. W and ya. You may feel inside the oral cavity that the tongue is taking various positions. That's why they are considered as gliding sound. So today it was about manner of articulation. Inshallah, in the next session I will plunge into the concept of vowels, and till then, I would like you all to stay updated and do support my channel. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.